My name is Godfrey, and I am the lead of the Multilingual Community of Practice. And today we will be talking about accessibility in general, but also in particular about what you need to do to make sure that non-English language websites or other digital products you may have are accessible to everybody. I'm delighted that I have two very knowledgeable colleagues from the Library of Congress, Willa Armstrong and Wendy Stengel, here with me, and they're going to walk us through the presentation, and I know we'll learn a lot of new things. As always, we will listen to the presentation and we'll have some time at the end to ask questions. So feel free to write them in the chat box, as Mara mentioned, as you think of them, and then we'll try to get to as many as we can. And with that, I will pass it over to Willa and Wendy with a very warm welcome. Take it away, ladies.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Laura, and thank you for having us here today. We're so excited, Wendy and I, to join you, Gabby, Mara, the entire GSA team, and everyone who's on the call with us. It's great to have you all here today. And as Wendy pointed out to me this morning, it is International Disability Day, so a great day for us to get together and talk about accessibility, particularly digital accessibility. So today, we wanted to talk about the basics of accessible content. So websites, PDFs, social media, some of the many ways that we're reaching out to the public. We're going to start with just a quick access check, but it goes over most of the things that Gabby has already touched on. Hopefully the slides are projecting for all on the call. And so, as Gabby said, participants are muted. We'll have a Q&A section at the end, and you can ask any questions at all in the chat. The slides will be shared as well as the presentation, and Wendy and I will share our email addresses as well if there are any follow-up questions, or perhaps you're joining by phone and can't access the chat. So let's get started with definitions of what is digital accessibility. Accessibility, when we talk about it in a digital context, when we're talking about the way that we're building our world, our social, digital, and physical world, we're talking about building in ways that don't create barriers for ourselves and others. So the classic example of how to create things accessibly is the curb cut, right? So a curb cut is that slope, that ramp that happens between a sidewalk and a street. The maybe 5-6 inch difference between the sidewalk and the street can be an insurmountable barrier or a very difficult barrier or a minor inconvenience, but all the same, it can create friction to someone navigating through our world. And there didn't always used to be a curb cut. There didn't always be that smooth ramp that would allow people to naturally traverse the streets and the byways and the highways. That was a decision, a design decision. We at one point did not decide to have curb cuts, and then we decided to build curb cuts. And in creating this artifact of the built environment, we made it so that all could more easily navigate and use sidewalks for the purposes that they were intended, and crosswalks as well. And they were necessary for some, right? Someone using a wheelchair to navigate, perhaps they needed that curb cut to be able to easily cross the street. But they're also a benefit to many. They are a benefit to someone pushing a stroller or roller skating, someone who's pulling their laundry to the laundromat in one of those carts or buggies. So that sort of twofold example, it was a design decision, and it's something that benefits everyone. If we think inclusively about the way that we're building the world, we're going to build it in a way that is equitable and lifts things up for all. So that's accessibility, but we're here to talk about digital accessibility. So what does that mean? Well, that refers to the hardware, websites, documents, apps, and more that we're creating. So ATM kiosks, the website that you go to order a delivery, the website that you go to see who your local representative is, the app that you have to check on your child's school attendance or other ways of communicating with schools, right? These are all parts of the way that we interact with and use the world today, that we're building the world. So we need to think about how to make these spaces accessible as well. We need to make sure they're usable, equitable, and enjoyable by all, including people with disabilities. And it's a shared responsibility. It's one that if you work in creating digital content or you work on, coding a website, there is a way in which you are responsible for the work that you do, that the work that you're doing is digitally accessible. And the product that you're creating will be of benefit to everyone in the public. So a quick note on disabilities. Disabilities can be permanent, they can be temporary. The link on this slide, which will be shared, of course, to be easily accessible, shares some videos on web accessibility perspectives that talk about some of the particular ways that certain disabilities, say someone who's deaf or someone who has low vision, may be impacted by certain decisions that are made in how a website is built or designed. So those are great resources for looking at some of the simple ways that we can design better and some of the principles that we'll go through in the latter part of this talk. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk a bit about some common navigation and assistive technologies, which will come up when we talk about certain principles. So keyboard navigation, this is an important sort of baseline to digital accessibility. Many people use their hands with touch, sort of swiping and touching their mobile devices. They may use their mouse to navigate their computer, their desktop computer. Some people rely purely on keyboard navigation. So they are using their keyboard to navigate through a website, to open and operate their word processor software without the use of a mouse. Right, they're going to use a tab key perhaps to navigate through links, arrow keys to navigate and manipulate forms. There are various shortcuts that they may use. So keyboard navigation is a common thing that we need to think about, someone who's not using a mouse, who's relying on the keyboard. And a lot of other assistive technologies as well map to keyboard navigation. So when we think about things like voice activation, software that someone is using to navigate through a web page, that may map to some of the ways that a keyboard navigates. So by kind of bringing it back to keyboard navigation and thinking, can somebody get through my website using just a keyboard? We're going to make sure that we're building so that the many different inputs that people use will work. Now, two other sort of software and techniques to know about are screen magnifiers and screen readers. So screen magnifiers are basically a digital magnifying glass, right? It's a software that can enlarge an entire screen or just a section of a screen that you can move around. It'll enlarge the screen. Often it will allow the user to change the colors. Perhaps for them, it is easier to read yellow text on a black background. Sometimes the screen magnifier will allow someone to make that change so that there's a greater legibility of the text that they're reading. There are certain considerations that we need to make when we're building websites to make sure that they work well with screen magnifiers. And then another thing to think about are screen readers. So these are a powerful technology that people use every day. It is a software that will read aloud the text and structure of a page. It's important to understand that it's not just the text, it's also the structure of a page. So a screen reader will announce which sections of a page are a link. They'll identify images. They'll communicate what type of form field someone is on if they're filling out, say, a form field. So we need to make sure that we're communicating with those technologies, that we're building documents and we're building websites that allow for a screen reader to navigate both the text and that structure of the page. These screen readers can be used by someone who's blind. They can be used to listen to the page and navigate, or with a refreshable braille display. They may be used by someone who has sight. They're seeing and they're looking at the page, but they're also using the screen reader as well in parallel to navigate in both ways. So those are some of the sort of technologies that are useful to know how the principles that we're going to talk about, when they're applied, how they may be used by some of these common assistive technologies. So how to create accessible materials, right? We're here today to talk particularly about accessible content. So one important thing to do is to work inclusively and to involve users directly, right? So having a diverse workforce, you know, listening to your own perspective or the perspective of your colleagues, and then also applying user experience techniques to bring in members of the public who have disabilities and can speak to their needs, and make sure that we're sort of building inclusively and thinking about our holistic public. You want to consider accessibility requirements from the start. You want to think when you first get a project or you're sort of identifying goals for the year, think about how are you going to make sure that your targets are accessible, that the ways that you're working and the things that you're delivering are going to be accessible. So building that in from the onstart. And then asking about policies and standards. So if you don't have a clear picture of what the particular policies and standards are of your agency or wherever it is that you are located, to make sure that you have that down pat. And then the other thing is standards and policies. So how we make things accessible, we use standards and we use policies right, we look to sort of some shared best practices and good practices on our application. So laws, be it federal, state, or local. If you are in a federal agency, obviously there are some clear-cut laws that you can refer to, and then frequently at the state, local, and other organizational policies, there are legal implications to digital accessibility. So that part of that, asking what your agency's policy is understanding what the particular established standards are. Here in New York City, for instance, the New York City government has decided on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So that is the standard that many places follow, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's the abbreviation, right, is WCAG, and it's often pronounced WCAG, which is a little bit, when you first hear it, what is that? Those are the Web Content Accessibility Standards. They are international standards that lay out principles and guidelines for building accessibly. And the Section 508, the portion that speaks to web accessibility, gestures to pulls in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So these two common and core standards are linked to, and if you're not familiar with them, they have tons of great resources for introductory as well as really advanced applications of accessibility. So I have included those on this slide as well. And then the last slide, just in this quick overview, what are some questions to ask, right? I'm a librarian, so what are the questions that we can ask? What policies have been adopted? Do we know how to make this product accessible? And then who's checking for accessibility? So some of the questions to be asked at the start of or during all projects. And now we're going to dive into the guts of why we're here today to talk about accessible content and some of the basic principles we can apply to all accessible content.
And I'm jumping in. Hi, I'm Wendy Stengel. I also work at the Library of Congress with Willa. And like Willa said, we're going to get into guts. If we're talking about content, for a large amount of what we deal with, we're going to talk about text, at least in some degree. Even our video and audio content will have text content with it. So let's talk about text. First off, let's think about PDFs. We've all encountered them on our websites, on other people's websites. It is vital for accessibility that we use machine-readable text. Machines need to recognize that text exists. If our PDF is just an image or a scan of text, then we run into some problems. But if machines can tell that text is there, then all of those great tools that Willa already mentioned, the screen magnifiers, the screen readers, all of those can be used by people who have disabilities or people who are using assistive technology to just make their life a little bit easier, to magnify text, to have text read back to them, to translate text, or to look up definitions of words. All of these things can be done if the machine can recognize the text. And if you don't know if your PDF has machine recognizable, readable text, there's an easy way to do it. Put your cursor over some text and try to copy it and then try to paste it into another document. If you can do it, hurrah, you have machine recognizable text. If you can't, you're probably dealing with an image and you're going to have to do a little more remediation. Scanned PDFs and images that have text are going to be more problematic than machine readable text. We want our machines to recognize their text, but we also want people to recognize terms. So for those of you who cannot see the screen right now, there is an image on the screen of white, off-white, beige, and brown structures growing up out of mulch at the base of a rotting tree. And this photo represents something that was attached to a report from a tree surgeon about a tree that they thought needed to be cut down because of what they were witnessing here. And I want you all, if we had more time, I'd want you to do a poll and tell me what you thought this picture was. And if any of you think that this picture represents fruiting fungal bodies, then you too could be a mycologist or really, really very dense tree surgeon. But for most people, if you were showing this picture and wanting to talk to them about the problem with their tree, you would want to talk about the fact that they have a lot of mushrooms. People need to be able to recognize the terms that you are using. And for the most part, that means we need to use language that is not highly technical and is not limited to particular fields. This sort of thinking comes to us a lot in the field of plain language, and plain language is accessible language. Plain language is something we could spend days talking about, and there's a great website that we link to in our resource slides and also on this slide, plainlanguage.gov, and I won't go into all of the principles, but I'll just get your mouth a little bit watering for why you should care. Plain language increases your content's cognitive accessibility. A lot of the times when we talk about accessibility on digital products, we think about visual accessibility and accessibility for the deaf and hard of hearing, but we also need to think about cognitive accessibility, people who have learning disabilities or reading disabilities, and people who are suffering from a migraine or who are exhausted because their baby was up teething all night, or people who are stressed because they're dealing with homeschooling their kids while working full-time and dealing with a parent who has COVID. Everybody who is dealing with any cognitive impairment whatsoever benefits from more accessible plain language content. Plain language content also improves every translation. When you don't use quirky, fun, very easy to come by colloquialisms, which I pepper my language with all the time, and that was one right there. It makes it easier for machines to translate clearly and for people who do not speak the language you're writing in to translate more accurately. The colloquialism I just used there was peppering my language. That is not something that is going to be translatable through every language clearly. Plain language also helps communicate complex information effectively. And when you communicate complex information effectively, then the people who are taking in that information are able to do those complex tasks more quickly and more accurately. If people can get through the drudgery of some of our government tasks without making mistakes, if they can get their taxes done without making a mistake, if they can file the form they need to get their unemployment, if they can get the healthcare benefits they need without making a mistake and then get the benefits they need, plain language has done its work and will make them happier citizens, and we will have done our job. Also, plain language is required by law for many of us. If you're in the executive branch of the federal government, you are definitely dealing with plain language as a legal requirement. Even if you are not, I urge you to read up on plain language. And if you want to talk more about it, reach out to me after. That's my mother calling. I'm sorry, there's no way for me to turn off that ringer because that's a landline. So we'll just keep on going and let's be quirky with my mother. While we talk about plain language, lots of people will think about plain language as a readability score. Lots of our composition tools, especially Word, have built-in tools to give you a readability score. And you can say, well, I wrote to an 8th grade level. Yay, I changed a few words and now it can be read at a 6th grade level. That's all well and good, but it doesn't actually get to everything that is readability, because our brains don't just look at words and say, I read the W, the O, the R, the D. That spells out word, and I know that that means a construction of letters that conveys meaning. No, our brains as literate adults look at a shape of a word, make a guess for what that is, make a guess within context about what the whole sentence means, and if that makes sense, we move on. We scan, we sometimes go back and rescan if it didn't make sense. That means that anytime we change the shape of a word, we make it harder for people to get it right on the first scan. Lots of ways that we can change the shape of a word. Most of them involve typography. If we capitalize things in funky manners, if we change fonts, if we underline things, if we add italics, if we use word art, all of these change the shape of letters and the shape of words, and all of these can make it harder for people to recognize what that word shape is. Doing that makes it less accessible. If you're going to do it, have a really, really, really good reason to do it. And I implore you, think hard about it. Once you have chosen your words and structured your words and designed your word shapes, we can then structure the composition of all of the words together. And we do that by organizing our content with headings and lists to communicate hierarchy. If we chunk our content in logical ways and use headings, we can then communicate what goes together, what is most important, and we can give people a way to scan through the content and only read what is most important to them. If you are a visual reader, you can think of looking at a page from a newspaper and scanning through the headlines and only reading the article about Great Aunt Susie's cotillion. Go Great Aunt Susie. The thing is, if you haven't used a screen reader, you can do the same thing with screen readers. Headings and lists help all readers of your content. You need to use headings in a logical manner though, and not just as design. So how do you build in that semantic knowledge? Thankfully, our composition tools have that sort of tool built in. On the screen right now, we're showing the ribbon from Word, and we've highlighted the style panel. Yes, Word makes it easy for you to build in semantic headings and semantic lists and semantic pull quotes and semantic everything you could need. You may not have been trained to use it. There's videos to learn how. We have stuff in our resources. And the great thing about doing this, there are two wonderful things. One, if you decide to change your styling, you can roll out styling and it will change throughout your entire document. And two, that styling will live with your document. If you need to export from Word to a PDF, those styles semantically go into the PDF. So your PDF is already going to be more accessible. It's really cool. If you ever need to create a really, really incredibly important document with a very detailed table of contents, the style palette is your friend. All of this will make your life easier, and it makes it better for every single user of your content. So I implore you, use semantic headings and lists to make your content more accessible. And Willa will now talk about other ways that we can make that content more accessible through design.
That's great. I'll start off by talking about color contrast. So color contrast, we want our text to be legible, easily legible by as many people as possible. For text, in addition to thinking about your word shapes and your font, you're going to want to make sure that there's a certain minimum contrast between the text and the background. And that minimum ratio is 4.5 to 1. So there's a ton of really great tools available for this. There's tools that are integrated into various design software programs. So Sketch, Figma, Adobe products, you're gonna be able to check, either add add-ons or use built-in tools to check for color contrast. The one that I tend to use when I'm sort of reviewing things or I'm doing an initial pass on a UX wireframe is the WebAIM color contrast checker. It's an online tool. You just hit the URL that we've shared in this deck, and you drop in the hex value for the two colors that you want to check. It's nice, it's simple. The other thing is you can turn it into a permalink. So let's say that you are working with a team and you notice the color contrast, or you're doing QA for a product. You can link directly to this the color combination. You can say, hey, we need to adjust this. It's not quite a strong enough contrast, and here's a link to a tool to see where that contrast ratio is. The image on the slide is a screenshot from the WebAIM color contrast, which lets you drop in those two colors, and it's showing that the sample teal and white background color have a 4.5 to 1 text. So that's color contrast of text. The next thing to think about is image description, or alt text. So alt text is more and more recognizable aspect of digital accessibility. That is the descriptive text of an image that's going to be used by someone using a screen reader, or someone who's throttled their data because they want to keep their data bill low for that month, or they are commuting and they don't have a good connection. In all of these cases, the alt text is what will be used to communicate the information of the image. So the image on this slide is of a diagram of a newsletter with some pictures on it, and each of the pictures are annotated with alt text required, because we want to be adding alt text on all of our images. It's going to be short, concise, 1 to 2 sentences or phrases even that communicate what the image is communicating. If you're new to writing alt text, you can ask yourself the questions when, why, where, what, to help articulate what should be included there. The why are you including this image, is the most important question. At the end of the slide deck, and that will be circulated, we have some resources for galleries of examples of alt text if you want to take a look at how some people are approaching alt text. There are alt text you can add on most platforms, and a growing number. So on the web, you use an alt tag, so it's part of the code, part of the markup, the alt. But you can add this on most CMSs. So if you are running your site with something like WordPress, there is an option in the editor to add alt text. Pretty much most social media platforms, the big ones, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, allow you to add alt text, and we linked to those how-to videos, again, in the resource section, so that you know exactly how to go and add alt text for all of these different platforms. So that's alt text. Some tools also for checking for alt text. Wave, which is capitalized W-A-V-E, and AXE, A-X-E. Those are some add-ons you can add to your browser. Again, we've linked to them in the resource sections. And these are 2 tools. They're free. You know, get them passed through your security, the security things you need to see if you can get those in use if you haven't already. And what they will do for you is they'll look at a website. They won't tell you if the alt text is good or bad, but they can flag if there is alt text that's missing on images. So they're a good check for web content, just did I add alt text or not? And then again, the various other publishing software, so Word and the social media channels that allow for you to add alt text. So the next thing to talk about is audio and video. So we're producing a lot of media content these days as we have more and more. We need to make sure that when we're producing audio and video that this is accessible to all. So one of the ways to do that is that we make sure that there are text alternatives. So similar to how we make sure that there's alt text for images, we make sure that our audio has a transcript and that our videos have captions, right? They describe, they capture the dialogue, they capture narration, as needed. Sometimes they capture significant sounds and background as well. And I wanted to take a minute to talk about captions versus subtitles. So we can capture the text, the spoken text of, say, a video, right? The spoken text of this webinar that we're having right now. When you capture in the language of this that is spoken, that's a caption. If you translate that into another language, that's a subtitle. To make things a little bit confusing, some different countries use different languages and some parts of the US use different languages, but essentially remember that there's that distinction there. The text alternative of a video, it could be in the spoken language or it could be in translated into another language. And we want to make sure that if we are producing a video or audio, that we have a text alternative that's in the spoken language of that video. We can add additional subtitles as well to make it more accessible to all and more available to people watching the media. But that distinction is important to know, that if we have added subtitles, that isn't necessarily fully accessible if we haven't added the captions that is in the spoken language. So we've talked through some of the ways to think about and check for accessibility in content. Again, the questions, what are the questions that you can ask to recap what we just went through? So ask, do my materials have machine readable text, right? Are all software is going to be able to interact with that? It's also going to improve your search engine results. Am I using plain language? Do I use headings and lists to organize my information? Are those headings and lists semantic? Do the machines recognize them as headings and lists? Is that clear to the software? Does my text have sufficient color contrast? Do all my images have meaningful alt text? And all of my videos have captions in the video spoken language, as well as my audio. Does all my audio have transcripts in the audio spoken language? So some questions to ask as you're producing these. Okay, then the next little section is about language. So these are some of the key slides where we talk about the intersection of multilingual content and accessibility. The big topic I want to introduce is language metadata. So websites and digital documents allow you to add markup that explain and identify in what language that website or document is written. So you can add metadata to your web page that says, this page is in English, this page is in Spanish, this page is in Russian. And when you do that, software is able to understand and properly interact with those web pages. You can do that, and you should do that at the page level for all documents. Every single document you make, every single web page that is produced should have this identifying metadata that says, this is what the language is this page is written in. Furthermore, for web pages, you can you can identify if there's a section of the page that's in a language other than the default language of the page. So if you have a page, for instance, about, let's say there's tours, your website is in English, right? And the majority of the content is in English, and the sort of initial introductory information on the content is in English. Your header, the first links in your homepage, those are in English, right? You're going to say this page is in English, but then perhaps you have a section on that page that is in Spanish. You need to add that additional markup, the HTML markup, that explains this section is in, say, Spanish. So I have a couple slides to illustrate what that means, and we have linked to some demos, so you have an example of that as well. But before we get to that, I'm just going to explain the benefit of this and why we have to do this. When you identify a language, a screen reader will correctly read the text. So if I am a screen reader user and I have my screen reader as default set to, say, Spanish, it's going to read the text that it interacts with in Spanish unless it's told otherwise. So if I come to a page that's not in Spanish, but that is in, say, Russian, it will try to read that text if it is as though it is in Spanish. And it's obviously going to be mangled. It's not going to be correct, right? It won't be pronounced correctly because the machine is expecting one thing and it's receiving another. The other benefit when you identify language is that spell check works correctly. If people are using automatic translation apps or features, then they will know what language to translate to. So something like Google Translate, it always is looking for web pages at this language metadata. So if that metadata is missing or incorrectly there, the language it will be looking in the wrong dictionaries. It will be even more off than automatic translation has, it will be completely wrong instead of, a higher opportunity for error. When you do identify your language, also your search engine results are going to improve. Google, Bing, other search engines are going to be able to recognize how to parse your page and put it into their search engine. Browsers will know how to handle punctuations like quote marks, right, which are handled differently in different languages. Decimals versus commas to break up numbers or currency, that's different, right? If you correctly mark up and identify the language, the browsers will know how to correctly handle that, as well as things like hyphenation, right? We have a lot of people accessing the net with mobile devices, smaller screens, a lot of people magnifying their screens, enlarging their screens so that it breaks into that mobile view. We have to know how to handle hyphenation, right? Where do those line breaks happen logically for the language of the page? And when you don't identify a language, your screen reader won't announce the text at all, perhaps, or it will announce nonsense. It won't read it out in the language of the page. Automated translations won't, search results, as I mentioned, won't work. Spell check, punctuation, hyphenation, those are all going to be incorrect. And those errors aren't necessarily going to be obvious to your users. It won't necessarily be clear that something is rendering incorrectly. Okay, so coming back, we've talked about the importance of it. How do you identify language? In documents like PDFs, you use the document metadata. So you go into the file and you identify what the language of the page is. In HTML, you use the lang attribute, L-A-N-G, the lang attribute. It's small but vital. So you use that to define every language of the page, and then you use it again anytime there's a different language. So let's go to an example. On the next slide, we've got a screenshot from USA.gov in Espanol. It's the page for the Library of Congress. The content is in Spanish. There is one link that's in English that says English. It's the link to the English translation of this page. So when we go to the next slide, we see that same screenshot, and then we see some of the code that is running that website, which is annotated. So at the top, for the entire page, it says lang equals ES, right? So it's that lang attribute. It's saying this page is in Spanish. But we do, remember, have that link that's in English text, in English language. So further on, when that link is written, we use that lang attribute again. We add that metadata that says lang equals en. So this link is in English. So this is this screenshot is illustrating that you identify the entire page and then you add that additionally for each for each section that's in a different language. And you could have 10 different languages on this page. You just need to make sure that you have 10 different, this markup is included in each time to identify those language switches. So because this is one of the crucial things, the next slide, we've got tools and tutorials for language identification. In the resources, we've got tons of additional articles for reading up more on how to implement this and the ramifications. But again, we've included those browser extensions that will flag if that is missing, as well as the particular pages for understanding how to add this in Word and PDF. So the next and last thing I just wanted to touch on is American Sign Language. So American Sign Language, ASL, is a language. It has grammar, vocabulary, accents. Since this is the multilingual community, we just wanted to touch on ASL and how ASL may be your customer's first and preferred language. It may be the preferred way of communicating. It may be that somebody can use ASL, or they could use CART, so live captioning like we have right now for this webinar. But they prefer American Sign Language because it is their primary language, as many people may prefer their primary language. So just wanted to note that about American Sign Language, that it is not a translation. It is not a sort of one-to-one to, say, English. It's one of many sign languages, and it is a unique and beautiful language with its own culture and associated with a much wider community, and that that's sort of where the importance of ASL is. So some questions again to ask. Did we add the metadata to the default language of our web page and documents? Are there pages in multiple languages? If so, do we add markup to each of those sections to make sure that it's correctly translated? And with that, that is us. So thank you again for joining us today. As I said, I'm Willa Armstrong. My email is on the slide, and with me today was Wendy Stengel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such an informative session. It was amazing. And I could tell that everybody was very engaged because there was a great deal of discussion over on the chat side of things. And I tried to capture as much as I could, especially some questions. So if we all have some time for questions now, we go until 3, so we have about 15 minutes. So I'm gonna try to ask as many questions as time allows. So one of them was, we talked about usability, right? We talked about that kind of thing. So somebody said, involve users directly. The government cannot burden the public. However, my organization has benefited from expert panels and market research. Our IT limits accessibility checking software. Does anyone have any recommendations for checkers? Is this something that either Wendy or Willa can address?
Sure. Yeah, the two that I shared that I mentioned, Wave, which comes as both a URL or a browser add-on, and then Axe, which again you can use in multiple different ways. You can integrate it into the development process so that it's part of your QA and it's kind of built in and will flag things. There's a variety of others. Pally, PA11Y, is another one that people have used. So those are some checkers that I have found they work for someone. I'm not a developer. I can use them to double check certain things, and then the developers can more easily sometimes integrate them into their workflow, with, of course, the caveat that accessibility, you can check some of it programmatically with those checkers, but you're always going to have manual assessments of it, which is why it's so important to sort of build those in as early as you can so that those checkers are more catching things, which of course, you know, that's the ideal situation, and we're not always in the ideal situation. So yeah, those are some that I would throw out there.
Of course, and I should say that I capture things as they were happening. So there may be that you've already answered this. So if you did, and if you feel like the recording already answers it, we can move on to the next. So here somebody asked, for all text on social media, if the graphic is in foreign language, but the channel predominantly posts in English, should all text be in English or in other language?
Ooh.
In the other language.
I would say you would have to have it be in both, wouldn't you, Willa? Because the why of including it, the why and the what is definitely language, that would be the language that is in the image.
Mm-hmm.
But the why is for the primary audience, which is the different language. Would you do a double alt text?
Well, I would, this may be a sidestep, but for when you have a very long, so often maybe you might include the language in, let's take like an Instagram post. So let's say you posted a graphic and it's got text in it. I would include the entirety of that text in the language in which it's appearing in that caption, if I could. And then you could also include the translation, because one way that benefits is that when you have an image of a text, if somebody is low vision and they magnify that image, sometimes it gets very blurry and it's difficult to read. And so by including that longer text in the caption, you're sort of making sure that everyone has access. But if it's, you know, a word and it's a smaller thing, I would include it in the language that it is written in the image.
Thank you. Another question that came in is, does plain language also include readability as a consideration? And I think you talked a lot about readability, but perhaps you want to address those.
It absolutely does. And readability scores are used a lot to help people judge if they're getting closer to their plain language goals. Plain language isn't only about readability. Readability is a part of it. With plain language, you have to consider your audience. When I brought up the mushrooms versus fruiting fungal bodies, and I love saying fruiting fungal bodies, if your audience really is a bunch of people who do nothing but study spores and molds and mushrooms, if they are mycologists, it might be more appropriate to talk about fruiting fungal bodies, and the readability score of that plain language, it would be plain language for that audience. The readability score might not be good for general audiences, but it's appropriate and plain language for that audience. So it's always a balancing act. You don't want to write for a third grade level if your readers are more advanced, though at the same time, balancing act. When you are writing anything, you're never going to really hurt if you write a little grade level lower. My favorite example is if you're writing about how to get help from FEMA in general, you want to make sure that you are writing at a lower grade level than you think is necessary, because when people do need to know that information, they are stressed out, and so they are not able to read at their normal grade level. They are having other things taking up their brain space, so they need to have things at a lower grade level so that they can understand it more quickly, more efficiently. Readability, big part of plain language, part of the greater ecosystem, I say with my hands.
Those are really great points. Thank you, Wendy. Another one talks about all caps, right? Can you speak to the readability of all caps? So it's a long question, but can you speak to that, basically?
All caps, people talk about all caps as being a poor choice in lots of instances because it makes people feel like you're shouting. And people, when they feel they're being shouted out, shut down. They feel like they can't process what they're hearing. But that actually does happen cognitively. If you look at the brain scans, I could go on and on about the brain scans. When you have all capital letters, our brains cannot see the word shapes the same. So we have to slow down and read letter by letter to make sure we know what each word is and what word it's next to. So we do have to slow down, and it does feel in our brains like we are being shouted at. It slows us down. It is something I would use very sparingly. There's a reason why stop signs say stop in all caps. It is meant to be very, very, very shouty, and you are meant to not be able to just breeze past it.
Another thing that came in was about talking about the accessibility of fonts, different fonts, especially for languages that do not use the Latin characters. So can you talk a little bit about that? Either one.
Oh, could you repeat that, Laura?
Yes, they're asking, I think that the person was Michael, was asking about the accessibility, about accessible fonts, especially for languages that do not use Latin characters. He cited Burmese, Karen, Bhutanese. Characters can be displayed in Word and PDF, but require specific fonts, or else the document displays a series of squares on screen. Or Arabic, for example, another one.
Yes. There's lots of research done on various fonts, and there are fonts that are designed specifically to be more accessible in almost any language. I know more about the ones that are Roman language sets. There's some great ones out for being more accessible for people with dyslexia, for example. Mm-hmm. My favorite one is called a font. It's APHONT. It's a great font. But I don't know the names of the fonts that are used in other languages off the top of my head. There's research out there to find them, and I can help try to find any if you have a specific one that you're trying to locate. There are more accessible fonts and less accessible fonts in any language that can be represented mechanically.
And the good thing is that if we don't get to all of the answers, or if you don't have an answer at the ready, but have some resources that you need to look up, I mean, people can email you and follow up, I would imagine. So another question that we had is, I heard that using quotations marks in alt text can mess up the e-reader reading of your alt text. Is that still true?
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one because I think it varies by platform. So when a screen reader is reading a website, the quotations are what says, oh, here's where the alt text starts and here's where it ends. So that can sometimes cause a screen reader to stop. However, things like Word, that might not be an issue. I think that, again, I'm fond of sidestepping. So what I do is I try to use the single quote mark to indicate a quote, or to end with a colon in the quote. To sometimes, if you're like, I don't know if this it's going to be an issue on this platform. Thinking about your grammar, is there a way you can make it clear without including the quotation? Because yes, it is an issue on certain platforms.
All right, I'm going to try to paraphrase this one a little bit. It's talking about, so when you are changing language, when I'm switching languages on phrases on a screen reader, there is a pause apparently. And so, I don't even know if I can read this correctly.
Yeah, no, I think I know which one you're talking about. So there was a question about screen readers when they switch between languages. Yeah, it'll pause to change the different speech engines, right? Right. So if it's just a word, and that is a very important point that I'm glad we're getting to. So we want to identify when chunks of language have switched, but we don't need to do that for things like proper nouns, language where it's become part of the rest of the vernacular of the rest of the page, the language of the rest of the page. So, and there's debate on that. But if I was writing a Word document, for instance, if I was writing a blog post in English and I used the phrase déjà vu, right? French, a phrase of French language, I might decide I'm not going to wrap this in the lang because it's become part of the part of English, right? It become an adopted phrase, and things like proper nouns. And so some of those small things, there are those exceptions that perhaps it's from another language originally, but it's become part of it, or it is a proper name. So.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I'm gonna, we're almost at time, so I'm just gonna pick the last question. Which WCAG rule number is what they want to know, states whether blank table cells are accessible or not?
I don't know the rule number off the top of my head. The links that we've shared have options for that. I can share my favorite, the link to my favorite quick reference for WCAG in the chat, but I don't know the one off the top of my head for the blank table cells. But yeah, it should be in there.
Okay.
And I'll also take just a quick minute before we close out to promote in the communities of practice, there is the 508 community of practice, which is a great place with so many knowledgeable people to ask questions that people can jump on and answer. So if there's anything that we didn't cover, you have our email addresses, and then that's another space that there will be folks to discuss it with.
And thank you so much. And I wanted to give a big round of applause, to Willa and Wendy for such a wonderful presentation. The comments on the chat, I mean, I don't know if you had time to check them out, but everybody found this very, very helpful. So thank you so much. And there are many, many claps here, the virtual claps. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your willingness to come and help us in the multilingual community, but the general accessibility community too, which is something that we're trying to promote, most cross-community interaction. We can help each other. And so I really appreciate you being here with us today. And thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much.
Bye all.